We're able to let some of the guys go and warm up. For example, I remember some using some of the heat guns in order to dry off their shoes because it was quite wet out there. Can a debrief be longer than a race? Obviously, normally I would hope not. That'd be a long time for me standing here talking to you. But on this occasion, let's find out. We had a question come in asking why we went for this sort of a halfway setup, not a full wet setup, given the conditions we had on Saturday and Sunday. Gone are the days where we really create a wet setup. You know, in the very old days, you would have raised the car off the ground a little bit to give it clearance. You would have changed perhaps mechanical balance with roll bars. You don't really do that in that way anymore. These cars are optimized around a certain ride height range, etc. But what you do and what teams have changed is the amount of downforce that they run, the rear wing, the balance on the front wing as well. And that's what you would have seen teams changing up and down between Friday, Saturday morning running and qualifying. The forecast in Spa is difficult at the best of times. We knew that there was chances of rain all 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Saturday maybe looked like the worst of all days, and that's not what transpired and happened. It's also very rare to have rain that is a constant level sitting on you all day. There's very few races in the history that I've been doing it where we've just had continuous wet running. Normally it will convert perhaps down to a dry level, then back up to wet with another rain shower coming in. So you try and do a car that's balanced around what you think the most likely conditions will be across Saturday and Sunday. And what transpired isn't what we planned for, clearly, and I suspect what most people hadn't planned for. If you knew it was just about qualifying, it'd be a very different setup to one that's based around qualifying and a race that could go towards inters or ex-wets at different points. In our case, we had a rear wing that was more suited towards that sort of mixed condition, more what you saw perhaps in Free Practice 3, if you saw that on TV. So conditions where it wasn't quite dry tyres, but it dried, another rain shower, and it got wet again. And as it was, that's where we thought the conditions would be, and that's where we pitched our car. How many sets of intermediate tyres and wet tyres, which we call ex-wets here, do you have available for qualifying and the race? The rules, and there's quite a large section of them covering exactly this, are built to ensure that we still have sufficient quantities of tyres if it were to be wet in FP1, FP2 and FP3. What I can say, and I'll take you through the different steps, is from qualifying onwards, not in a sprint qualifying weekend, but a normal race weekend, of which is all but 3 this year, we would have 4 intermediate tyres and 3 ex-wet tyres. The intermediate tyre is a little less robust than the ex-wet. The ex-wet, as long as it's running in wet conditions, is actually quite good. It doesn't degrade or deteriorate very quickly. The intermediate, however, has very much a good initial performance to it and does drop off, and it does wear, especially because the inter very frequently we run in conditions that are running down more towards dry, so you damage the tyres. So the inter is the resource you've got to protect the most. And that's why there are regulations covering specifically that intermediate tyre. What the rules state is that on Friday, if FP1 or FP2 were declared wet, and that's a message that only the FIA can put up, and that we use that tyre, we run on the intermediate tyre, we're allowed to have another set of intermediate tyres for qualifying. The significance is therefore we're now able to run in the FP1, FP2 conditions, learn about the car without fear of damaging that tyre such that it doesn't become usable for qualifying or the race. There's a further regulation that states even if it hasn't been wet on Friday, but rain is forecast such that P3 looks like it's going to be declared wet, again, they'll replace and provide another set of intermediate tyres for us. So we always go into qualifying with 4 new intermediate tyres. And that's important. In that qualifying that you saw in Spa, we used all 4 sets. If there had been a wet qualifying and a continued wet race, that would have meant that we would have used up our allocation. And really, had we done any other running on any other compounds prior to that, you would have really been eating into performance. You would have been eating into what happened in qualifying. Why did we put both cars out at the beginning of Q2 on used intermediate tyres? This really falls back into the answer to the previous question. We have 4 sets of new intermediate tyres for qualifying, 3 sets of ex-wet, all new. But there are 3 qualifying sessions, and more so than that, a qualifying session, when it's very long, 18 minutes in the case of Q1, might mean that you have to run multiple sets of intermediate tyres in order to get the best out of it, in order to get a lap time that puts you through. In Q2, that was exactly the case. Everyone really had to run new intermediate set tyres towards the end of that session. One tyre was just dropping too much performance by the time you used it again for most cars. Q3, which is obviously the session that now defines the grid, that's the important session to make sure that if you can, you want 2 new intermediate tyres available to you. But to get 2 new tyres available in Q3, you really can only have used 2 tyres across the entirety of Q1 and Q2. The result of that is going out on used at the beginning of qualifying 2, especially with the forecast which was showing that it would improve throughout that session, just meant that you could save that precious resource, the new intermediate tyre, right for the end of it. So we went out, it's a process we've done at other tracks before this, but noticed that the entire grid was on new inters. And furthermore, there was a little bit of a risk of rain coming in earlier in that session. And as a result, we decided to abandon that program, come immediately straight back in and fit a new intermediate tyres to make sure we're not offset to the field. Now, as we stand here now and knowing how that session evolved, actually, we probably should have stayed on program. We should have stayed out there on that used intermediate tyre such that we fitted a new later. Not because we needed to save the inter. As you saw, Q3, in fact, turned into expert conditions, which wasn't forecast, but more because it meant that a lot of the time we were spending coming back in and back out the pits, and it's a little bit of learning that we lost on that inter tyre. What happened to the W12 in the wet conditions? It looked like both Lewis and Valtteri were struggling. I think that's a fair assessment on the balance of what happened, but there's a lot more to it. We definitely didn't do the right program during qualifying, not just during Q3, but I don't think we did the optimum in Q1 or in Q2 either. And every single lap that a driver has available to them matters in those conditions. Spa is incredibly difficult as a track in the dry. Now add the fact that turn 1, which isn't really a corner, it's one braking zone, the first proper corner they experience is Eau Rouge, up and through. And in the wet, that is flat or nearly flat. You're asking a driver to commit in conditions they have no idea about. They don't know what's even on the exit of Eau Rouge. They don't know how much grip they have available to them. But to be fast in qualifying, you've got to commit. And that's what makes Spa difficult. Not just is it wet, not just is it such a long track that the conditions in one part could be completely different to the next. It's that you have to commit to an aggressive level of really performance and grip without truly knowing how it is. With the W12, we weren't quite on the pace of others. In Q2, I think it's fair to say we had new sets of tyres, as did other cars, and Norris and his lap was faster, but they were also running a downforce level more suited to it. We went for a setup that was a little bit more balanced for conditions that could be drier than they were, and especially a setup that I think had Sunday been inter conditions or varying between inter to going towards dry, we would have been very strong, but that's not what happened. So that's the first element that comes through. We had a little bit of a bias that would have suited other cars on Saturday. The second is that in those conditions, we missed out on some essential laps for the drivers. At the beginning of Q2, they were trafficked on their lap. Then on the second lap, the tyres weren't quite at their best, and we stopped and fitted new in the box. And when we did, you saw Lewis moved up to the top of the timesheet. So we had a car that could be competitive in those conditions, but everything had to be right for the drivers. We had a little bit of locking, a little bit of struggling just to get the car slowed down, not just ourselves, but other cars as well, into a few of the turns, turn 1 and turn 5 probably being predominantly the key areas. Now, that's not to say other people didn't struggle from that, but clearly we did, and that hinders your confidence as well in the car and the laps that you have available to you. Then finally, come Q3, George's lap was obviously incredible, but also the program they completed, I feel, would have helped them. We did a lap 1 with a slow lap 2 and then a lap 3. Verstappen did the same program, but that middle lap just took a lot of temperature out of the tyres. It was there to try and cool the tyres down, make sure that they're ready to go, and also make sure that we were just in towards the field so no one had a big advantage or disadvantage on where they're positioned on track. But I feel we just took too much out of the tyres by doing that. They weren't quite ready, and that's what you saw in turn 1. We just weren't in the right place on grip. George's program was one where they knew they couldn't push immediately after they went out in the experts. They had to do a slow preparation lap. And actually, overall, I think in those conditions, that might have been the right program. What is aquaplaning? Aquaplaning, in short summary, is when there is more water passing through the tyre than it is able to clear out of the way. So the tyre isn't in contact with the ground anymore. You don't have grip to the ground. This happens for clarity in road cars as well. And many of you, I'm sure, have experienced this already when you're driving. Perhaps you're just driving at motorway speeds and all of a sudden the steering is a little bit light or the car moves a little bit laterally left or right. And what it means is that all four tyres aren't in constant grip with the ground. They're not able to provide the grip required anymore because they've been lifted off the ground. And obviously it's a key moment, a dangerous moment. The big difference with a Formula One car is obviously it's travelling at Spa, for example, at around 300 kilometers an hour. So we're asking the tyre to move a huge amount of water out of the way and ensure that we can still get the car slowed for braking. There are rivers in Spa at a number of places, and that's typically where you'll see these aquaplaning moments. It's where the water pools or is at its deepest. One tyre is okay, but once you start getting multiple tyres, you are simply going to lose control of the vehicle if it's for a sufficiently long period of time. How did the team spend the 3 hours waiting for the restart? It's an interesting question because it developed quite organically across that period. For the first delayed start, we were only given 5 minutes worth of warning. And 5 minutes warning means that we simply have to remain exactly in position as we would normally. The tyres have to be bolted to the car, the driver has to be in the car, and all of us have to be prepared for the fact the race can get going. And 5 minutes is barely enough time to get everything in order. Once the delay goes up to 10 minutes, it might feel as though that provides us enough time, but it isn't. The wheels still have to be bolted to the car and ready to go. The gazebos and all of the coverings that you saw on the track have to be moving out of the way at around about 7 minutes to go. And what it actually means is that every time when you saw it happening, we just got notification as we were clearing off the grid and had to put everything back in place again. So 10 minutes was just on the limit of the window where really everyone had to remain there prepared. Once the sessions kept getting delayed more and more, and we were given a higher timescale, we were able to let some of the guys go and warm up. For example, I remember some using some of the heat guns in order to dry off their shoes because it was quite wet out there. And in the case of ourselves, we stayed predominantly on the pit wall for certainly the first few hours, then migrated to truck when we knew we had a half-an-hour window. Lewis was in there, Vowles were in there, and Toto was in there as well. And we were able to have just a short catch-up and brief over what could happen going forward, review together the regulations, understand what's going to happen with the weather forecast, and just really align the team again without being outside in the cold. But in these conditions, you're pretty much remaining race ready throughout. As you saw with the final bit of notice, we were given 10 minutes to get ready. And if we were elsewhere or unprepared at that point, you simply couldn't get the car leaving in that period of time. 10 minutes is just enough time to get the driver to the car, bolt it in, and get ready to go. How many cups of tea or coffee did you have? I mean, it's an interesting question. I think I had 3 cups of tea in that period. We're very fortunate. Whilst we're out in the cold, we had a couple of cups of tea brought to us. I remember one year, it wasn't this race, where one of the engineers took their thermos and filled it up with coffee, literally filled it, just to make sure they could get through. But one of the problems you have is actually you really can't drink too much when you're out on the pit wall. Let's imagine the race had got going and you had to sit there for an hour. What I can guarantee you don't want is to have 3 cups of tea and sat there wanting to go to the loo for an hour. So you dose yourself. We had a question coming in asking about drainage holes in the chassis, assuming that there were some. Well, there aren't. It would weaken the cockpit, obviously, to drill holes in the bottom for the purpose of letting water out. But it's not a bigger problem as perhaps it may seem. First of all, the actual cockpit opening, whilst there isn't a driver inside it, is covered at all times. We have an umbrella typically over the entrance or a gazebo that we put on top of it when we know they're there for a longer period of time. And otherwise, there's a driver sat in it which pretty much occupies most of that entryway. And of course, he's wearing a suit that will absorb water. And the car will get heavier. If I had to guess, it'd be a couple of kilos that the car gets heavier by due to the fact it's been raining. And the rain will pool in various locations. But Once the driver's out, if you look at the bottom inside the cockpit area, there's not really a huge amount of water that collects in there at all because of what we've just described. Where it does collect is you can get some in the radiators, some in the ducts, some in just a few places you wouldn't even believe, but that isn't critical apart from just making the car a little bit heavier. The cars are also very, very waterproofed these days. So we ensure, for example, the steering wheel can deal with the fact that it's being exposed to the elements for a couple of hours. And that applies to other electronics within the car. Thank you again for all of your questions, and we'll be back next week after the Dutch Grand Prix.